Hi, everyone. So we're getting off to about 5-minute late start. My name is Darcy Clarke. I'm going to be talking about web content and creative constraints. Just to get everybody sort of going, this is the last talk. I know we're all ready to go have beers. Could I get you all to stand up for like 2 seconds? Just stand up. Put your laptops aside. Okay. Put your hands up. Right? Okay. Take a deep breath. Great, you guys can sit down now. Okay. So I've got your attention at least for 1 or 2 minutes. So like I said, well, that's a little tired puppy. So that's what I thought most people would be like at this point. I'm happy that you guys stuck around this long, so appreciate that. So a little bit about me. You can follow me at Darcy on Twitter. It's kind of cool. I have my first name as my Twitter handle. It's a blessing and a curse because I get tweets like this sent my way. So for the record, I don't like techno. I don't know who that is, and I feel bad for their kids. But I'm typically referenced as a developer. I spend my time doing front-end development things. I also consider myself a designer, and I'm kind of a unicorn. I'm also a UX advocate, kind of. So that's sort of how I summarize the way I look at designing and developing. I always try to advocate for the best user experience. So some work I've done. Does anybody know Themify? 1 person? 2 person? Oh yeah, not you guys. So this is a company I started. It's makes WordPress themes. I also did some work for Google, Microsoft, a bunch of cool guys. A bunch of cool companies, actually, when I was working in the agency world. Also helped out a bunch of startups. I've worked on some open source projects as well. Does anybody know front-end development interview questions? Developer interview questions? You might have heard about them. Okay, cool. So I worked on that project as well. And you can follow me at Darcy Clarke on GitHub. I'm a Canadian, which is kind of cool. Any Canadians other than the 2 or 3 people that are here? Sweet. This is me watching the playoffs last year. And I have to apologize, as typical Canadian, for a couple things. We've had some bad exports to the US lately, like this and this. I apologize on behalf of my country for this. But I think we made up for it with guys like this, you know, right? Right? Yeah, pretty good looking dude. And especially a guy like this, Chris Hadfield, if not only for his awesome mustache. Oh, okay. Yeah, so that's Ryan Gosling. He's a babe. So what to expect? I'm gonna be sort of zooming in and out of these slides because they're all different font sizes going on. So W3Cs. So web content and creative constraints. I sort of had fun with the title. It's a little vague, so I'm going to talk about what that actually is and what I meant by that. I'm going to talk a tiny bit about accessibility, detecting context, which again I'll sort of explain in more depth, go over some layout stuff, some cool things you can do to manipulate layout, images, typography, and video. So when I talk about content, and our web content and creative constraints, I'm talking about 2 things really. Essentially content and constraints. And those are just convoluted words that came together to create a kind of fun title. So what is actually content, or what do I mean by content? I mean anything from text to images to audio and video. And that's what I consider content or media. So what are the constraints? So in this day and age, we have everything from, well, constraints are essentially context. What is the context? We have tablets and mobile phones. We have your desktops and laptops. We've got now interfaces on watches, in malls, big displays. Tablets are interfaces now also in your car and also in your eye. And she's extremely happy about that. So, and the problem is with all these contexts, you also have fragmentation with the actual software that's being run on these hardware devices. So I'm going to zoom out here. This is sort of what I picture when I consider context and then content within it. So the frame around this sort of web page looking thing is the context, or it's the constraint, and the content is sitting within that. So when we talk about solutions to really creating good content on the web and actually having it respond and live within these constraints or live within these little environments, there's usually two design sort of features that come up: adaptive or responsive design. And that's sort of how we essentially solve the problem of, or not problem, but essentially how we make our content live within all those different environments. So responsive design is typically thought of as having fluid widths, consistent content, and it's implemented with just HTML and CSS. So I have a quick demo of what that looks like. If we pop out full screen here. So you can see that in this example, the content is essentially just responding to the me resizing the window, and it's just changing place. There's not actually, the DOM isn't changing. The actual content within the document isn't being changed. It's just using CSS media queries to essentially manipulate what it looks like. Mm-hmm. I've lost my... Okay. Go back. Cool. So when it comes to adaptive design, we actually start to think about fixed widths with breakpoints, again using usually media queries. And sometimes there's actually device-specific content changes, and this is usually done with JavaScript. So you can tell it's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that are now being the catalyst to that implementation. Essentially, I'll show you the difference here. So we can switch to adaptive, and you'll see that at certain widths, the actual content will adapt and have a fixed width layout. And in certain cases, in sort of that adaptive design idea, you start to see content actually being either taken out or added to the design. So in both of these cases, they require context. They require an understanding of the environment in which the content's living in. And essentially, both of them adapt based on those constraints. So this might be not mind-blowing to anybody, but in my personal opinion, adaptive is responsive design. The two are interchangeable. Those are two sort of words that I consider to be almost the exact same thing. They both require an understanding of where the content requires an understanding of where it's living, and they essentially change their style and functionality based on that environment. So with that out of the way, you can start to look at your layout more as little components that are going to react to the environment in which they're living, instead of one big document. And these are essentially what I was referring to before in content, as far as text, images, video, audio. And for me, the baseline of, or you should be sort of thinking of a baseline when creating a web page as far as what do you want to serve up, or what do you need to serve up? What is sort of the core, what needs to be in your document compared to what's sort of supplementary materials? So text obviously is the given. You need to have content in your HTML document for things like screen readers and search engine spiders. So essentially, a progressive enhancement is kind of like a peanut, if anybody's ever seen this before. You want to start off with your content, which will be your HTML markup, and then add on things like CSS, and then finally add things like functionality enhancements with JavaScript. And just be careful of like DOM mutations. I think a lot of people start to forget about the way that screen readers and they sort of forget about the serving up content when they start to build single-page applications, and they start to forget about actually serving up all their content first, so it can be properly indexed and read properly. So again, spiders, accessibility. You want to be concerned about the people that may not be able to see or changes that you're making to the DOM. And this is a good statistic actually from a blog post that Paul Irish wrote a couple, actually it was last year, and he was referencing some really good blog posts and some good studies that come out about accessibility. And the key here was it was 98.6% of screen readers users have JS enabled, meaning that those devices, those assistive devices, can actually interpret JavaScript, but we don't really have a good understanding of how good the usability is of those things. So there's a couple links here. You guys can, I'll have the slides up later. But the biggest one, or the most interesting link here, is actually HTML5accessibility.com. So I'm just going to pull that up for a sec. And what this website has is a whole bunch of sort of rankings for different browsers based on their support for essentially new HTML5 elements and the support for functionality with them. This is really cool because it says, whether or not a browser is implementing proper keyboard functionality for assistive devices and exposing an API like the accessibility API. And actually, I think Firefox is the one that does the best as far as implementing essentially ways to access functionality within HTML5 elements, like the video tag or something like that. So I'm going to start talking about actually manipulating content, actually doing some fun things with new specs with CSS and HTML and some JavaScript. Words of caution, some of this stuff is behind things like Chrome flags. It's also sort of bleeding edge. This is stuff that you can potentially use right now, again, sort of with that understanding of progressively enhancing your experiences. So we essentially want to bend the web to our needs. We want to bend it to our what we want to do with it. So the first thing we need to do usually is actually detect context. So in order for us to make smart decisions about how we're going to implement some sort of feature, there's a couple of different ways that we can actually detect what kind of context we're living in for us to make smart decisions about the content. In the past, there were a whole bunch of browser hacks. Has anybody implemented these in CSS before or looked at these before? Yeah, a couple people that are being around for a while. And there's just a ton of these different browser hacks that you can use in CSS that essentially let you directly specify one browser over another just with like some weird CSS that is sort of, this is like an antiquated way of doing that. So yeah, oh my God, hacks. So we now have things like media queries, so media queries essentially let us, again, detect what kind of context our content is living in and make decisions based on that. So you can use width, height, orientation, resolution, scan, aspect ratio, and color, all with the media query API in CSS to do some things. So Here I'm showing it essentially in HTML. You can put in the media attribute. You can put in essentially a query for max width in this case. So you can essentially load in a style sheet when your web browser is at 800 pixels. You can also sort of stack these queries, so max width 800 pixels plus orientation landscape. Again, this is a way for you to curate your content in such a way that it's actually responding to the type of environment it's living in. Another great API actually within CSS is the supports. It's more recent. There's again a good link there for, this will be up online afterward, but essentially MDM has great docs around this stuff. So here you can actually say with the supports CSS API whether or not the browser actually supports a CSS attribute that you want to use. You can essentially sort of make a fallback for that. So here in the top box, I'm actually doing that in CSS. You can see I'm saying, you know, does the browser support display Flex for FLEXBOX implementation? And then I could fall back if not. And then I'm also here in the second one. Again, you can stack those sort of queries. So I'm saying display Flex and background size cover. Then I'm going to do something with my CSS. And these also has a JavaScript version, this API, so css.supports. And essentially, you can either put in the first parameter is the actual property name, and then the value is the second second property that you pass into that method. So, or you can pass in just an entire string for the query. Another way to actually figure out what kind of context you're living in or what kind of features are available to you is actually with feature detection with specifically Modernizer is probably the best library for this. Or if you want to cherry pick sort of tests that they've done, it's always great to go check out their GitHub repo and sort of take one-off sort of implementation. So in this little snippet at the top, actually, I'm showing you, this is what it kind of looks like if you run Modernizer on your website. It adds a whole bunch of classes to the HTML tag about what your browser actually supports. So it runs a whole bunch of tests and gives you a whole bunch of information that you can use in your CSS if you want to, or CSS or your JavaScript to make decisions about what you want to do with your content. And in the second little snippet here that I have, I'm actually doing just my own sort of feature detection by checking if preload is actually in the video element. So I'm just creating a new video element there, and I'm seeing if it supports the property preload. So this isn't sort of in-depth feature detection. It's sort of just saying, does this exist on this object? So you can get a little bit more in depth. Modernizer definitely does that. They have some tests that actually go out and do crazy things like implement video for checking if auto loop works, which is really interesting if you're trying to do anything on mobile or something like that. So the last sort of way that you can detect or get information about the environment in which your content's going to live is through user agent detection. And this is kind of, well, it's definitely a pain point for a lot of people. They don't like to think that user agent detection is actually worthwhile. I actually wrote a little library, a little script that essentially takes in a YAML file full of regexes that Steve Souders, I think, had put together at Google, and had since then has been sort of adapted and added to. And what this allows you to do, user agent detection, although it can be spoofed, although it can sort of break down, it actually lets you make smart decisions that you can't make with feature detection. So although you might know that something is supported, you don't know how well it's supported. So sometimes you have to make very specific decisions about what you're going to do as far as JavaScript or CSS is concerned and what you're actually going to implement as an experience. So for instance, if you're working with mobile devices and you know that Android 2.3 devices do support GPU acceleration, you also you need to know that that isn't very good. The performance isn't very good, and you don't want to actually try to throw any of your CSS transitions to the GPU because it's actually extremely slow compared to just leaving them run on the CPU. So that's something that feature detection doesn't tell you when performance is bad. It just tells you whether or not something is supported. So this is an example of user agent string that might come from the browser, and then this little library that I wrote essentially parses it and gives you a whole bunch of information about things like the browser name, device type, mobile, tablet. So just a bunch of different things. So I'm going to talk a little bit also about manipulating layout, text, images, video. Not so much anything about audio. It's just way too big, and I haven't had even that much experience with it. But definitely there's going to be some fun stuff that I can show you about video, and definitely about layout. So everybody knows about box sizing, I think, or border box. Essentially, this is the de facto now way that people essentially standardize how the box model works in CSS. So if you've seen this, there's a great post by Chris Coyer, the CSS Tricks, and he does, I think that's supposed to be a slash, sorry, .com/box sizing. So essentially, there's a CSS property box sizing, and if you've ever worked with the old school quirks mode, IE versus standards mode, you understand that essentially padding will either be added to the width or taken away from the width once it's set in CSS. And so this sort of standardizes this across browsers. So if you set a width of a box, you're not going to find out that it's actually being increased if you add padding to it. You're going to know that it actually gets taken away from the width of from the content that lives within that box. Another kind of cool sort of layout way to manipulate the actual content is the CALC method. This is kind of new, not a lot of people use it. It allows you to essentially mix different unit types, so percentages, pixels, EMs. You can actually do some calculations based on those different unit types, and they can come up with some kind of cool ways to implement padding and to adjust your layout based on essentially different constraints of what that element's living in. So here I've just basically said take 100% width and then minus 20 pixels times 2. So you can actually put standard, just numeric, like integers, and do some multiplication and subtraction and addition to create some really cool sort of not algorithms, but cool equations to come up with your width. Sorry, say that again? Sure. Well, you can't go negative. It would be 0. Yeah. I'm almost positive. I would have to go test that, but I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it wouldn't give you a negative number. That's not possible. The compute style would be 0. I'm pretty sure. Or yeah, I would have to look into that, but I'm not sure exactly. So yeah, that was essentially a quick way to add padding without actually using the padding property, essentially using calc. So that's kind of fun. The FLEXBOX implementation across browsers is really interesting. It solves a lot of the problems that we've been having for a number of years. And I got a quick demo again. Let's see if we can pop this guy out. And so essentially with FLEXBOX, while it solves a couple of problems, but it definitely solves the problem of layout if you've ever dealt with floats and clearing floats, yeah, divs and table layouts. And if you've lost the ability to vertically center something, it helps you solve that problem too. So in this little demo, essentially all these elements are living as they're set as display flex, and the middle box here you'll see as I resize the browser, essentially just takes up whatever space is left within the layout. So it actually understands the size of its siblings there living on either side of it. So that's kind of really cool. There wasn't an easy way to do this before in CSS, and the FLEXBOX API helps you do that. So if we want to look at the code again, essentially each one of the boxes just has that class .box. We've got the different vendor prefixed display box. There's about 3 different implementations of FLEXBOX, so just be careful if you're ever implementing this. Definitely check out Chris Coyer again at CSS Tricks has a good post on the different implementations. I've got some links at the end as far as like how to figure out what to use and the different APIs, how to know what's available to you as a developer in implementing these things. But just be mindful that this has definitely been one of the specs that's had the most flux. So you can see that I also essentially just have 2 other classes for vertically and horizontally orienting FLEXBOX. So fairly simple, and it gives you sort of a lot of flexibility with your layouts. So manipulating text. Again, this is sort of going back to what can we do to change the content. And some cool sort of APIs, specifically font smoothing, although not a spec, you must be mindful of that. It was originally back in 2002. I think there was a spec for font smoothing. WebKit or Safari and Chrome do support font smoothing, and this essentially gives you a much better rendered looking text. And there's some good blog posts about it. But again, this is sort of non-spec, but really lets you have some control over the way that your text looks. Something that's sort of the bane of my existence, I actually implemented my own version of this. I still haven't released it. But line clamping is one of those things, or multi-line ellipsis has sort of been a bane for a lot of people if they've ever dealt with text. And WebKit has an implementation of line clamp, their own sort of like with FLEXBOX now, they actually have the ability to set ellipses on anything that overflows a certain number of lines. But there's actually, again, another good post by Chris Coyer sort of talks about this, and he references a demo as well as some work that was done by David DeSandro about a couple of years ago, finding this little snippet of code. But there's a few different ways that you can essentially achieve this sort of line clamping ellipsis. So you can see there's 3 lines of text here, and then you get that little ellipsis at the end. So there's this demo essentially showing you all the different ways that you can achieve this line clamping sort of experience with different, there's JavaScript libraries as well as pure CSS implementations. The best one I've seen so far was by a little script by the Financial Times team, and it's called FT Ellipsis. It's on GitHub. Essentially really simple to implement. It still it allows you to maintain the same CSS that you would have had normally. So you just set a fixed height to whatever your element is, and it's going to figure out how to essentially clamp down on the content in there, so you don't have overflow, scroll, or auto. You get like a nice ellipsis at the end of the last line that you want to essentially clip. So Sorry. Close this guy. Cool. One of the team at Adobe actually that's here, hopefully some people have talked with them. And if there's anybody here in the room that might be from Adobe, they've been doing a lot of really cool work around this kind of stuff. If you've seen Reflow, if you've seen any one of their many projects they now have that are sort of pushing HTML5 and web standards, they actually have really cool blog posts about sort of their now involvement in standards and specs, and one of them that they want to actually get implemented at some point is something called balanced text. And again, if you've ever done any sort of work with text, or if if you're a designer, you come from a design background, you understand how crappy it can be to implement some sort of element that has text in it, and essentially with responsive layouts or with anything that sort of changes the width or that how the content is laid out, you can end up with widows, you can end up with a whole bunch of really poorly looking text. So their idea is to actually take an old the old text wrap property, which is no longer implemented by any browser, and add a new value that you can essentially set, which is balanced. So what this does is it gives you a much better, much more readable version of your text. So you can see the before and after of just the alphabet there, and it just looks a lot cleaner. And you can see it gets rid of, or tries to make sure that there's no widows. So that's like a sort of the new guy hanging out by himself. So they actually have right now a plugin that you can use today to create this. To create these great-looking pieces of text, as well as a blog post sort of explaining the reason why they want to do this, and the reason why just text align justified doesn't sort of meet all their needs. So here's another sort of demo of that same thing. You can see the default text on the left, and they've actually taken and justified it on, or they've taken and done balanced text on the right. So especially in the caption, I would say you start to see that things just look way nicer, and that it's actually much more beautiful, and that this is definitely something we probably want to have in CSS in the future. So multi-columns have been around for a while. Implementation is kind of weird. There's a couple things that I think are still missing from certain implementations, especially like column span. But multi-columns are really interesting. And essentially all you have to do is, I took my list item here and I said column count 2, and it spreads my content over multiple columns. I could change it to 3, and I would have 3 columns worth of content. Once column span and potentially the grid specification actually get implemented, or they get sort of thought out, this is going to become a really good way to lay out your content. Here's another example of just another multi-column implementation. Here I've set actually a fixed height, and you'll notice that when you do that, you set a fixed height on a multi-column element, and fixed height and width. That you actually see the content overflows, and it actually overflows maintaining your column count. So it's going to continue on to paint 2 columns all the way down. It's interesting because this is actually in the spec to do this, and that's kind of just like a neat thing that it doesn't sort of break its the way that it's laid out. So manipulating images, I'm sure some people, maybe most people, hopefully anybody, has heard about responsive images and sort of the discussion that's been going on there. There's a really good group called the Responsive Images Working Group that's led by a bunch of really smart guys, mostly out of Boston. Filament Group is has done a lot of work with it. And specifically Scott Gill, really smart guy, has really helped lead that, as well as Matt Wilto. So there's two implementations here that were sort of up for debate, and I think still going to be. But these are essentially the ways that we want to, or the two implementations proposed to have responsive images. So you can see in the first implementation, the picture element allows you to set either source set or both a media query. So similar to what we looked at before, you can set a media query and it will actually tell you what image to use. And this is really important when it comes down to the fact that you don't want to be shipping huge images to somebody that's on a smaller device that doesn't necessarily need a bigger image. If they've got a smaller width device, they don't need a huge wallpaper size image to be downloaded to their device, especially if they're on mobile. And the other implementation just adds an attribute to images already, and that's the source set attribute. And again, you can sort of set what the images you want based on some parameters about the environment. So in this case, 640 width, and there's also basically this also allows you to do things for Retina images, or if you want to be serving basically 2 times the size of your default image, you want to be pushing more pixels to better devices like your iPads and your iPhones. So there's actually a good implementation of this right now. You can start using this. It looks a little bit verbose, but this is actually how you could implement responsive images right now. Scott Gell, who is actually working with the responsive image working group, created POLYFILL, essentially giving you this script that you can run, and as long as you implement sort of all these tags, not necessarily all these, but whatever you want as far as the sizes you want and the media queries you want, this will give you support for sort of responsive images. The only problem with this is that you don't get any sort of browser preloading or prefetching of your images, because everything is essentially gets pulled out by JavaScript and then loaded. So there's a little bit of a fallback for that right now. There's some really cool things as far as filters. Now, this isn't specific to images, but this is probably the coolest part of CSS for me, is filters, blending modes, all that stuff essentially makes Photoshop more and more relevant in my workflow, which is really cool. So here, WebKit, Chrome has this implemented, essentially filters for elements. So here we've got a sepia filter. I could even change it to like 20% on the fly. You see the image is being changed. Let's go higher. Is it easy to see? Okay. I guess it is better at 90%, 190. Right. So you can go from anywhere 0 to 90% with that specific sepia filter, but it's really cool because you don't have to actually do any sort of image editing in Photoshop. And there's other ones like brightness. Again, you can just on the fly or in your CSS change the brightness of an image or an element. So that's kind of cool. As well, there's also grayscale, so we can actually tone down. Could go 20%, or we could do 100%. Essentially, make black and white photos on the fly. Again, there's great demos for this kind of stuff to go even more in depth with more of the APIs for filters. HTML5 Rocks actually has a great blog post on this, and so here's a sort of picture of the Golden Gate Bridge, and you can just start to see, you can change these inputs and start to see the different filters be applied to that image. So this is another way that you can essentially manipulate images and also just any elements with CSS. Masks also kind of not being used right now. And again, this is sort of additive. This is not something that you want to rely on, but you can essentially take a mask like this circle here and apply it to this little beach, and what you get is an end result of a nice rounded sort of beach effect. And you can see you can also do this with gradients as well. So I put a linear gradient as a mask, and I applied it to this image again, and you see that nice sort of fade effect be applied. Something that has sort of recently come around, again from the Adobe team, really smart guys that are trying to push things. They've been working with the Chrome team quite closely. And essentially it's this spec is called blend modes. And if you've ever done any kind of blending in Photoshop, again, you'll notice that it's very similar to that sort of implementation. And so you can see here, we've got background URL, and in Chrome Canary, our WebKit nightlies, you can essentially blend a color into that image. And there's actually a great demo to sort of play with these. So here we go. We have another sort of background image, and we're setting color, and we can essentially change the blend mode of that element to anything from multiply, screen overlay, whatever you're used to typically in Photoshop, and you're doing this right within the browser, and the browser's interpreting how essentially the image and that element are going to be rendered and painted together. So you can change, there's a couple different images you can change to. Apparently the waterfall is the only one, or the only one that loads. So that's kind of cool. That's another way that essentially we're pushing the web to be more efficient and essentially allow us to manipulate things like images. Manipulating video is something that kind of cuts close to home for me. The last couple months I've been working with a company called FLEXBOX, who essentially does cinemagraphs. If anybody knows what that is, they're kind of like hyped up animated GIFs. Responsive video is essentially, there's a problem with most implementations of video like YouTube and Vimeo, as far as when you try to make that element, that iframe, responsive. Essentially, when you go to resize the window, the flash element within it won't respond correctly, and it's sort of janky. So you have to actually wrap most iframes and most video implementations with some sort of wrapping element. In this case, I've added sort of a class video here. And then you need to add some CSS specific to actually making that element responsive. So the key here is actually this padding bottom. It looks like a really weird number. 56.25% is actually just, it's just a whole bunch of math. And at the bottom, I've actually done the math for you. What that number represents is actually the aspect ratio, which is 16 by 9. So you do 9 divided by 16, you get that number, and then you times it by 100, and that gives you the actual height that the video element should be based on 100% width, and that gives you a responsive image, or responsive video technique. So you can see that I've applied that to the wrapper, and then I essentially just make sure that any iframe object or embed that's going to be inside of that wrapper is going to be position absolute, top 0, left 0, width 100%, height 100%. So it's going to take up that entire space and look really good. So I got another demo just quickly of that. You can see this is actually a video, and as you're sort of resizing the window, you see it responds properly. So no flashing, no problems with any kind of like flash embed sticking to a improper value. So like I said, for the past couple months, I've been working with a company called FLEXBOX. And essentially, the problem they gave to me, as far as a case study, the requirements they gave to me, they wanted us to have video work on mobile. And if anybody's ever looked at a website that has video on it, you'll notice that most native implementations of mobile video in the mobile web is broken. Essentially, the OS takes over the entire experience. You have to click a play button. You can't autoplay. You can't auto loop video. So that's kind of a little bit broken. So the requirements I was giving was create something that's easy to scale or create at scale. It needs to be small file size, high quality, and performant on all desktop browsers and performant on mobile. So this was a huge task for me. And the current implementation was essentially just to push GIFs to mobile devices in order to get something to play automatically. So that was not ideal, and to this day, we're still sort of working on a solution. But I want to talk about some potential solutions in the future for video and essentially having video actually work in sort of these unideal constraints. Essentially, what I looked at first was video decoders. And if anybody has been sort of following this, there's been some work done with, about a year ago, there was an MP4 video decoder that was written entirely in JavaScript that came out, and it was called Broadway. Now, you can go to that link, but the project hasn't been worked on in about 9 months to a year. So I continued to sort of investigate what else was out there, and I started to find that there was a number of video decoders out there, all written in JavaScript. And in my mind, this is pretty much the way forward as far as video is concerned. Something that isn't locked down to an OS or to some sort of proprietary license. The most exciting one of these was actually the last one, the WebM video decoder. And it's based off the VP8 spec. And you can see it's actually by the same guy who did the WebP video. Actually, that's a WebP image decoder. But essentially, this is a way for us to actually get video working on mobile devices. And what these decoders do is they decode each frame, or they figure out the deltas from the video format, or from the video file, and then they start to paint to canvas. So there is a canvas requirement or dependency that you'll have to be okay with. But it's really cool. So I want to kind of show you guys what this looks like. The frame rate on mobile is the biggest problem right now, but it's probably one of the coolest things that's around right now. So. The internet's going to work. Okay. So we've got this example if it loads. So essentially here, it's going to load up the WebM file and actually start decoding it on the fly and with JavaScript and painting it to canvas. Not using the native video implementations, totally circumventing that. And this is a potential solution for mobile in the future. So here I'm just going to click, and this is a test file. So should start to load. Let's see. Go to fail. Go to. There we go. Let's do the story, the Google story. So I actually went through the code that actually was created for this library and tried to give some feedback to the guy who actually implemented it. Still waiting, still have a pull request in, but yeah, should load up. can also drag in something. There. Let's grab this. Okay. Yeah. I think the internet's dying on me too. But essentially, I got this working on mobile devices. We got into the pipeline. We started generating WebM, which is actually the smallest video format that you can get out there, similar to WebP. They're based on similar specs. And I think this is loaded now. Let's see. There we go. Cool. So this is actually, again, a video that's being decoded on the fly. You can see the frame rate. And it just played once. This is only about a 6-second video. I wonder if I can play again or play this Google story. No, it's not going to let me. And essentially, this is probably the coolest thing that I've been working on lately. And I definitely suggest that you guys start looking into things like this as far as sort of circumventing poor implementations of features or, again, things that don't, features that aren't even there, sort of coming up with creative ways to solve these problems with CSS, JavaScript, and HTML. So a couple of links for you guys to actually take away. How do you stay up to date? How do you know what kind of APIs are out there as far as how do you manipulate content, CSS, JavaScript, you know, where do you get the information on what's available to you? Can I use is a great place to actually just check if something is supported. And HTML5 Please uses actually, can I use information to create an even better way for you to sort of implement new features. It gives you a lot of suggestions as far as what you have to do, whether there's a polyfill or shim out there. HTML5 test lets you know what kind of coverage you have for different implementations as far as video, responsive images, things like source set. If those get implemented, they'll essentially go into a test here, and you can see whether or not your browser supports that. And probably the best resource that's out there right now, as far as progressive what enhancements concerned and creating or using all the new and shiny features, is this list of cross-browser polyfills that's actually on the Modernizer GitHub. I guess the community, it's associated with the Modernizer group on GitHub. And if you just go Modernizer wiki HTML5 cross-browser polyfills, this essentially will give you support for things like multi-column implementations. You can see there's SVG here. And this is a great resource for essentially libraries that will help you use the features that potentially aren't implemented natively. So that's about it. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to come up to me afterwards, or we can go have beers and talk about this content or HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And thank you.